We have 7 speakers, and with them, we're going to cover off the following themes. We're going to be looking at the top line lessons learned, as well as the impact on patients, both those with and without COVID-19, the impact on demand for drugs in intensive care units, and also the impact on supply chains and manufacturing. And we'll be wrapping that all together to see how that can feed in, not just for if there's a second wave of the coronavirus, a future pandemic, but also what it means for the EU pharmaceutical policy in general. Now, if I could just run you through a couple of housekeeping points. In terms of how it's going to work, each speaker will have a short slot, which will consist of me doing a mini interview to bring out the salient points that they'd all like to make. And there will also be an opportunity for you, the audience, to ask questions right from the word go. So if you'd like to ask a question and you're watching on Zoom, please put your question via the Q&A function. And if you're watching via YouTube, you can either submit it via comments or chat. Now, there's quite a lot of you watching today, well over a couple of hundred. So you have a much better chance of getting your question picked up and selected if you could tell us who you are, to whom your question is addressed, and also if you could limit yourself to 1 sentence. So if you write a PhD abstract in the Q&A, there's a very good chance you're not going to get picked. So please keep it succinct and short if you'd like to get your question into the participants. And with that in mind, we're going to kick off with our first speaker, who is Christoph Stoller, who is the President of Medicines for Europe and also from member company Teva. Christoph, you're going to give us the big picture and the context now. Can you tell us what made COVID-19 such a challenge in terms of medicine delivery?
Thank you, Laura, and good morning to everybody. A very warm welcome from my side as well to the many participants. It's a great pleasure to have all of you with us this morning. Before I answer, Laura, I would like to acknowledge on behalf of Medicines for Europe, the many thousands of people who have lost their lives due to COVID-19. At the same time, let's also celebrate the many more patients who have been able to pull through thanks to the great healthcare systems we have across Europe. But there is more to COVID-19. We do also have patients not related to COVID-19, and we should not forget about them. I was really struck by the WHO study, which have been released recently, demonstrating that 80% of the services related to prevention and treatment of non-communicable diseases have been disrupted due to the COVID-19 crisis. And I believe this is a situation that we cannot accept. And that's a situation which really requires immediate action. I'd also like to thank all of the healthcare professionals who have been working day and night during the last couple of months in order to treat the patients tirelessly through this time. And last but not least, as a person being active in medicine manufacturing myself, I would like to thank all of the people directly involved in medicine manufacturing. I would like to thank all of our more than 190,000 employees of the members of Medicines for Europe who have worked tirelessly day and night through the last couple of months in our more than 400 manufacturing sites, in our 26 R&D sites across Europe, in order to ensure the supply of medicines in Europe. It's a great privilege to work in this industry and to know that we are helping to improve people's lives. So now I'm happy to come back to your question. If we look back, when this all started, when this all kicked off or really kicked in February, March of this year, we have seen a situation that I personally have never experienced before. We have seen borders closing. We have seen lockdowns in countries in Europe, but also outside of Europe. We have seen hoarding of medicines as well. Just to give you one specific example, in my case, we have seen an increase of paracetamol demand of more than 800% in a couple of days within March of this year. So we have seen an unprecedented surge of demand of active pharmaceutical ingredients, but also of finished dose formulations. So looking back, I think we can be really proud of our European industry, of our manufacturing resilience, of the security of our supply chains. We did not see any major shortage or any major disruption. And that was really thanks to all of the business continuity plans that all of our members had in place. But of course, yes, there have been challenges. We have seen challenges. There have been unilateral actions taken by some member states or by some countries also outside of Europe. We have seen challenges on the logistics side to move goods across Europe or to move goods into Europe. We have also seen a lack of coordination and a lack of solidarity. And all of this we have tried to put together and to summarize in the lessons learned document that Medicines for Europe has issued very recently. On the positive side, the European Commission, under the leadership of Commissioners Kyriakides and Breton and Leskovac, a dialogue has been installed and has been set up. A dialogue between the key stakeholders, between the European Commission, between the industry, and with the member states and with the European Medicines Agency. And that has really been crucial. That has really helped to ensure the joint understanding. That has really helped us in come up with the challenges that we have seen, and that has helped us to come up with solutions for these specific challenges. And that has also increased the trust, I believe. It is now really, we have reached a level of a two-way dialogue. And that is especially important if we move into the next phase. The European Commission has recently kicked off the development of the new pharmaceutical strategy in the European Union. And in that context, that's really crucial. And I hope we can continue to move into that direction. And last but not least, that was a long answer, Laura, I know. But last but not least, let's not forget, COVID-19 is not over yet. We hear it every day from within Europe, but also especially from outside of Europe. And this is still a burning platform. And we need to continue our strong work in that context.
Thank you, Christoph. Given that we are still in the middle of COVID-19, why did the industry decide to, or why did Medicines for Europe decide to do the lessons learned exercise now? And also from your personal perspective, you took over as president of Medicines for Europe last year, obviously with no idea that this was coming. What has it meant for your presidency?
Yes, the aim of this document, Laura, is really that we wanted to share in a very transparent and open way our reflections, but also the lessons learned from our point of view. It is really about policy recommendations. It's really about learning from such a crisis. Like always in a crisis, you learn during the crisis. But I think what is really crucial that going forward, we then also implement and execute the actions so that we are better prepared for a next pandemic if one would come. And you're absolutely right. When I took over my presidency of Medicines for Europe in September of last year, nobody had even heard COVID-19 at that time. And I would like to remind everybody that when I took over my presidency, I have set out the priority number one of Medicines for Europe to ensure equitable and sustainable access to medicines. After all, we as Medicines for Europe, we supply 70% of the medicines in Europe. So what we have asked for now is nothing new, right? All of our asks have been out before. What I think has clearly changed is that COVID-19 has shed a new light on the situation. It has increased the need for action. And therefore, we really wanted to issue this document in order to ensure or to increase the likeliness, maybe if I put it this way, that we really ensure implementation. So what does it mean for my agenda? At the time, I set out that we need to increase the access to off-patent medicines, that we need to increase the security of supply. And as I laid out earlier on, we can really be proud about the resilience of our supply chains. But we need to make sure that this is going to be there also in the future. We need to make sure that we can preserve the strong manufacturing footprint that we have in Europe, and hopefully we'll be able to even strengthen it going forward. And there is some work to be done on the front of regulatory optimization, but also on the front of digitization. And of course, these the last two topics, they're also linked together very, very, very strongly. And I think, let's not forget, I think no single actor has the silver bullet. So it's really about having this stakeholder-oriented approach, to have this action-oriented dialogue with concrete outcomes. And in September, I have asked the European Commission for the setup of a high-level pharmaceutical forum, which did not take place until we were in the COVID-19 crisis. So I'm very happy that we have now installed this high-level dialogue with the key stakeholders around the table. And my key ask really is that we are able to continue this. We need to be ready for the next pandemics, and therefore the key objective is really to learn from this crisis and to prepare ourselves better for the future.
Thank you very much, Christoph. Just very quickly, if you could tell us, can you give us an example of where this sort of high-level dialogue was helpful in the crisis? So what was the value added of having this forum? Can you give me one specific example?
Absolutely, it was really crucial. It has been set up by the Commission very early in March, and that was, if you look back, that was the time where suddenly the borders were closed, where suddenly our truck drivers were waiting 48 hours at borders. They didn't know if they would go into a specific country, if they could get out of the country, if they would have to go to quarantine. And we were able to bring these challenges to the table of the Commission, and then to discuss this, to discuss about solutions, and then these solutions or ideas have been implemented. In this very specific example, the green lanes have been implemented, and that's just one example, and that really has to be continued.
Thank you very much, Christoph. And if we could go to our next speaker now, we're going to have a look at the impact on patients during the crisis, and not just patients with COVID, but actually patients who need to get access to medicines which were not related to the crisis. So I'm very pleased to introduce Nicola Bedlington, who is a special advisor to the European Patients Forum. Nicola, from your perspective, what were the main medication challenges that were facing patients with chronic diseases or who were particularly at high risk from getting COVID themselves?
Thank you, Laura, and good morning, everybody. And thank you very much for the invitation from Medicines for Europe to be here. I'm delighted to be with you today. So since the beginning of the crisis, EPF obviously engaged very closely with our member organizations, and it's clear that COVID-19 has really exposed many gaps and weaknesses in health systems that our communities were already well aware of. And it brought home once again the importance of strong European public health policy, and indeed the kind of cooperation that Christoph referred to earlier. Health system capacity to really provide ongoing quality of care and medicines has been a real challenge and concern. And of course, patients already with chronic diseases are amongst the most vulnerable. Higher risk if they actually contract COVID-19, and of course any disruption to healthcare provision affects them disproportionately. So it has been a big issue, and this was very well reflected in the WHO report that was referred to earlier. In some areas there have been pragmatic solutions found. In Madrid, for example, the mayor decided very quickly to allow a home delivery and real local pharmacy coordination to facilitate access to treatments, following a request from our member organisation. Unfortunately, this has not been applied across the whole of Spain in all of the autonomous regions, and this is a very good example, I think, of increased health inequalities even within countries. So while keeping patient safety a top priority, EPF called on the member states to facilitate local pharmacy pickup and home delivery of treatments and medication, and to ensure accessible and affordable telemedicines. There was at a certain point a huge surge in demand for drugs treating certain aspects of COVID-19, leading to specific shortages, but also a sense of fear and concern in certain disease communities like lupus and indeed rheumatoid arthritis. But this was very swiftly responded to, I think, in all fairness. So I think when it comes to supply of medicines, COVID-19 highlighted some of the challenges around protecting the health of populations while delivering essential goods and services across Europe, as Christoph highlighted. We've tried to work really closely with the EU institutions and with industry. In a statement back in March, we called for coordinated EU action to ensure timely supply of medicines, protective equipment and supplies to patients and healthcare professionals across Europe. And of course, we supported strongly the Commission's guidance on transport of medicines and the green lanes that industry again was very, very influential in making sure that happened. I think it's important to highlight the shortages existed before the crisis and will continue to exist after the crisis. And we support very much the European Medicines Agency work in this arena. This access to medicines is really crucial, but I'd like to situate it into a wider context. The isolation, the anxiety, the mental health issues that patients with chronic diseases and COVID, I mean, this is huge, and this isn't only a health crisis, it is a humanitarian crisis. It's also an economic crisis that will have an impact for many years to come, and that will clearly impact on the patient community and stakeholders working in Brussels and at member state level, and we need to work collaboratively on this to get it right.
Thank you, Nicola. So what would you say is the most important lesson to take forward from this, not just for the next wave of the pandemic or a future pandemic, but also for pharma policy in general?
Well, I think we need to address the bigger structural issues of integrated care, personalised care, and obviously the pharmaceutical industry have a role to play here. We also need to think about joint up policies, health, social and employment policy working hand in hand. We need to look at preparedness. We need to look at the value of health data. We've seen how important that has been throughout the crisis in terms of managing this, but more could have been done. And I think the investment in ECDC, the European Centre for Disease Control, is really critical. And indeed, the overall thinking about a robust health programme at European level is very, very key as well. In terms of access to medicines and supply, I think the importance of an effective flow of clear, accessible, reliable information on access to ongoing treatments, therapies and procedures are really, really important. I think the needs of patients were largely forgotten in the public discourse, and of course the general panic around COVID-19, and we must learn from that, because that information is absolutely critical for patients living with a long-term serious condition. Digital health solutions have already been mentioned. I think the whole digitalization of health will be really key also in the context of supply of medicines, and it's going to be really very important that these are co-designed with patients, that digital health solutions aren't just dreamed up in isolation from patients and healthcare professionals, but we're part of that conversation. Also, digital health literacy, digital health skills for both patients and healthcare professionals will be also, I think, very, very important, and will actually be a key priority for EPF in the coming years.
Thank you, Nicola. And finally, very quickly, we've heard that up to 80% of health services were disrupted or interrupted during the pandemic. How do you think we can avoid these mass scale disruptions in second or subsequent waves?
I think that at local level, in hospital settings, I think there's much more experience now in terms of actually tracking, tracing, isolating and managing in a different way a COVID-19 outbreak and continuing some level of service to, for example, an outpatient clinic dealing with people with multiple sclerosis, for instance. I think there's been a lot of learning in a local context. I think in the policy context more broadly, as I mentioned earlier, genuine, authentic European cooperation where the whole range of stakeholders come together and really think through how things could be done differently, and genuine preparedness, I think, is really, really important. None of us could imagine at the beginning of this year the impact of this crisis, and I think we're all living through something extraordinary. I think there's a huge amount of learning happening, and I think it's very, very important to actually think and listen to the experience of patients themselves going through this and picking up some of those key messages that need to be injected into both policy and practice moving forward. I'm sorry, you're on mute, Laura.
Thank you for, yeah, thanks, Nicola. That was great. We're now going to move to our next speaker and look at the impact of extraordinary demand for intensive care unit drugs. And James Byatt is the Executive Vice President for the EMENA region for Accord Healthcare. James, can you talk us through, paint a picture of what actually happened to supply and demand when the pandemic hit of the kind of drugs that you're helping to manufacture? And how did intensive care units and companies deal with this situation?
Thanks, Laura, and morning, everyone. Look, I think it's a really important and positive story to share. For me, it started back in February when we had really the first logistical impacts of COVID in Italy. Overnight, key areas were red zoned, and it became clear we needed to plan for additional supply security of critical medicines. Back then, the treatment protocols for COVID were pretty unclear, but it very quickly became evident that there was a huge new use of mechanical ventilation. To put someone on mechanical ventilation requires inducing a coma, and that needs a cocktail of 3 or 4 classes of medicines. So that can be neuromuscular blockers, sedatives, vasopressors, as well as analgesics, anti-infectives, and blood thinners. But what's really important to understand is that without all of these classes of medicines, the treatment just couldn't be successful. There was a lot in the press at the time about the race to get more ventilators, but what you didn't really hear was that without that cocktail of drugs, they were effectively redundant. And it felt like that was not always really given the political or media recognition it required. What really exacerbated the situation wasn't just the number of patients getting mechanical ventilation, but how long and how deep the sedation was. So patients typically required around 6 pump lines running continuously, often for 4 weeks or longer, and that drove a huge step change in demand. Simultaneously, we're seeing challenges to output caused by staff attendance issues, the logistics barriers that were mentioned before, as well as issues with API access. So it really was the perfect storm of a massive increase in demand at a time of new supply pressures. It was also a real struggle to estimate the demand, especially as each class of medicine had like a pantheon of agents that could be used. So the Medicines for Europe members quickly got together and we worked at identifying a critical list. We vetted that with counterparties. So we talked to leading ICU physicians and groups, as well as our in-house experts. It was quite a dynamic list as the treatment protocols started to vary and different countries had different preferences for the various classes. But that effort to quantify and validate the critical list was a very helpful beginning to start to break down the problem and quantify the need of drug per patient. You've got to remember back then we were in an ever-expanding pandemic, and it was vital we had a handle on the various scenarios in terms of the incidence over time. This would give us the demand profile over the coming months, something that was vital for factory planning. So we then began working on building out an epidemiological model, which outputted the time series of each medicine's demand per country. So there were quite a number of different approaches trialed. We looked at the R rate per country or the pace of doubling of cases, but the main challenge was the variability of testing regimes in each country. Simply put, the reported incidence of COVID was not the real level. So we actually pivoted to using the number of deaths. This was seen as a more reliable metric. Ultimately, a truer proportion of deaths were being captured in the official statistics. So we updated this model daily using published stats and used this to plot various scenarios as to how we saw the patient load growing in ICU over time. We vetted this model with many of the key members of Medicines for Europe in the industry. And we finally felt we had a credible demand forecast that could be used to quantify the problem. I think it's fair to say it was apparent that many of the authorities and counterparties didn't have enough detail on their real need. I can remember an instance during a meeting with key procurement leads in a national health system where they basically admitted they were just guessing and they'd just multiplied by 3 their regular demand for these key products. As context, our model was predicting something like a 16 or even 20-fold increase. I think one of the most impressive things about the modeling is that we checked back recently and for data looking at April to June, the model predicted to a 95% plus accuracy. And I think this is a real testament to the efforts, particularly of people like Susanna, Cash, Anthony and Callum, and all those involved in building that model. I think the other thing to try and convey is that at the time, we were just being inundated with inquiries for additional demand of these medicines, not just in Europe, but all over. And we had no way of vetting the validity of the requests versus what sort of stockpiling had already occurred, and recognizing there was a bow wave of the pandemic around the world, and that had implications on where best use of stock would be. You know, we had to avoid putting contingency stocks into markets that had a lower immediate need when there were actual outages of some products in some countries. But the problem was information. We had no idea what each company was supplying to each market, whether each player was focused on making the same few medicines in the cocktail. For all we knew, everyone was supplying the same few medicines to the same few countries. The problem was really competition law. We're prohibited from sharing that type of information. So Medicines for Europe approached the DG Comp, who rapidly understood the problem and the need for all classes of medicines required for mechanical ventilation for the exercise to be successful. So they gave us some guidance on flexibility regards competition law. However, we really didn't feel this was enough. So the executive of Medicines for Europe decided to contract an independent advisory to build what I termed a clearinghouse. And that was there to process the data in a confidential fashion at an arm's length to vet what was being produced versus our model, as well as the demand that was coming from the buy side. So I was really impressed that shortly afterwards, the Commission issued clear written guidance and a comfort letter for the project and created direct oversight of the project. FPA and its relevant company members also joined in, which was a definite plus. And I think that collaborative approach is a real credit to the industry, to Medicines for Europe and the European Commission as to how quickly that idea went from hypothetical to reality. And in my opinion, that's something that ultimately saved lives.
Thank you, James. What do you think then was the most important lesson or the most useful lesson that you learned from this experience, and in terms of taking it forward? What are the lessons that intensive care units and those who supply them should be thinking about in terms of when the next wave, well, we're still in a wave, but when the next wave hits or even going forward?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there's quite a few. One that sort of came to mind quite recently is check your facts. I talked about the impassioned demand. Sometimes in the heat of the moment, people recount things incorrectly and it sets off chain reactions. So I think one thing I learned is it's better to spend a few minutes or hours to check the truth. But I mean, coming to the bigger picture, I think it's really important that the authorities, the governments recognize the importance of the off-patent industry. We supply the majority of these medicines and we're a vital industry in pandemic defense. As we've seen, ventilators don't work without medicines. I think for me, we need to maintain that clearinghouse approach, making sure we're looking forward. We look okay to September based on the current scenario, but we need to stay alert to that potential second wave. I think governments and health systems need to implement appropriate contingency stock build and pandemic tendering. That's not panic buying. This needs to be a sustained activity over time, even for the next pandemic. And a topic that's really close to my heart, we need to really encourage resilience in the supply of medicines by reinforcing the need for value-based procurement. If there's a race to the bottom on pure price buying, it tends to lead to a lack of resilience in the supply side, and that's not what you need during a pandemic. So I'd encourage support for surge capacity, for that stock build, and not necessarily just from domesticating supply chains. It's about a multifaceted approach and making sure that there is surge capacity in the system.
Final quick question. Do you think we're in a better position on demand forecasting for next time as a result of what's been learned? You talked about some of the guesswork that had been done and the work that you're able to do internally to get the correct profile. Do you think we're in a better position to predict what that will be like when the next wave hits, or do you think it's just going to be a similar kind of scrambling exercise because it will be a different kind of dynamic to the pandemic probably?
I think it's yes and no to that. I think on the forecasting side, yes, we're definitely more prepared. I think one of the challenges is we've depleted inventories in the supply chain to meet the need of the first surge. We're desperately trying to build up additional capacity and inventory, but you've got to recognise, as Christoph sort of alluded to, many regions are not through the first wave. If anything, it's growing. So there's huge pressure on factory output to service the need in those regions. So I think we're better at understanding the problem, but we've got to recognise, now's not the time to be complacent. We need to build up those contingency stocks.
Yeah, Thank you. We're going to talk a little bit about supply, manufacturing and resilience and capacity in a moment. Just to remind you, the audience, if you want to ask any questions, feel free to post them via Zoom or in the comments or chat section if you're watching via YouTube. And please tell us who your question is for. We will get them to the speakers as quickly as we can. So please do ask your question and tell us who you'd like to answer it. We're going to now move on to sort of talking about the resilience of supply chains and building strong manufacturing capacities in Europe. And to talk us through all of that is Rebecca Guntern, who is the head of Europe at Sandoz. So Rebecca, one of the things that we've already had highlighted, not just by Christoph, but also by Nicola, and also actually by James, is that there were some shortages already before the pandemic, not everywhere, but that there were some supply shortages. And how did it exacerbate them? What did you see from the production manufacturing side?
Well, Laura, so at any time, I think it's very important to say again, at any time, our top priority was to really ensure access to medicines and security of supply for patients in Europe. This said, and we just heard also, I think a disruption for patients is really a major concern because it really negatively impacts the treatment. And COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted once again, I think, the extreme importance that we see in having a really solid but also robust supply chain. And we faced an increased demand, which was unparalleled, right? It was a huge challenge for us as an industry, but in some cases doubled and tripled the annual consumption just in 2 weeks. So I think the good news, and I think we can also be proud of, is that we kept operating. We kept operating in the worst of the crisis. And I think this was only possible because we immediately implemented a business continuity plan, but also, and this was mentioned a couple of times, a really strong cross-industry collaboration. The supply chain, and you mentioned it, shortages have been there before. I mean, supply chain is a very complex ecosystem, and shortages have multiple root causes. So it's not just one, it's very, can be from regulatory, quality, manufacturing, so different angles. And I think there's a part where the manufacturer, of course, is in control, but we also have some stuff which it's beyond our own control as manufacturers. And we saw them specifically in COVID, and they really affected the supply continuity, namely border closures. So within Europe, where we had to really push and escalate to get the green lanes, but also I would say export restrictions coming from China and India. The other one was stockpiling. So we saw it at all different levels. We saw stockpiling at a patient level, at pharmacy level, at wholesale level. And I think everyone here can imagine that it's very challenging then to do the right product allocation. So to have really the product at the right place, at the right time, and in the right country. So maybe to conclude, 2 learnings. So the first is disruption to global supply chain did not cause really severe and critical shortages at patient level during COVID. And this is also because we have still a very strong and I would say solid manufacturing footprint in Europe, which of course now we need to review and to further strengthen and most critically to maintain. And secondly, we need really a united European response. There is not a single solution. And we need cooperation between governments and the industry because we really firmly believe that the tackling of the shortages cannot be the sole responsibility of the industry. It needs and requires much more broad stakeholder coordination.
Thank you, Rebecca. And so, of course, we understand that this put a lot of challenges forward for manufacturers. And it's also, I think, really reiterated the debate around manufacturing in Europe. So can you tell us what companies are actively doing to secure sustainable manufacturing and supply in Europe?
Yeah, sure. So the first thing is, I think I'm 13 years in the industry. And what I really welcome, and I'm pleased to see that I think we are starting this and accelerating the discussion around and about sustainable manufacturing in Europe. So this is absolutely critical. COVID-19 has shown and highlighted really the value of this industry. So it's a huge importance what we drive to drive the access and ensure access to critical and essential medicines for patients in Europe. Today, we have the members of the Medicines for Europe, they still have over 400 manufacturing sites and 190,000 employees. So I think as a first step, and I really strongly believe we need to maintain capacity. We need to maintain manufacturing and supply capacity, but also to implement a proper risk management plan, which we have seen now work really well. And I think we need to continue to do this. What do I exactly mean? First of all, I would say we need to reduce really dependency on a single region. But we need also to look in other measures like dual sourcing, inventory strategies to have the goods already in Europe and then to really make sure it is more resilient. While I believe it's most probably unrealistic, I would say, but also a bit risky. We cannot really have manufacturing in one single region. But I think Europe needs really to focus on critical medicines, like, for example, antibiotics, but also ICU medication, as James just explored. And I bring an example from Sandoz. We are the only remaining vertically integrated manufacturer of antibiotics, so to say, penicillin, in the Western world. So this case, I think, and this example really shows there is a long-term trade-off between price and also if you want to have a resilient and security of supply. So if you take this example and you look at Europe, and in many countries, you would see that antibiotics, a pack of antibiotics, which is life-saving, costs less than a pack of chewing gum. So this said, how can we seriously expect manufacturers to bear the solution alone? In this sense, we need an industry, I would say, strategy that looks beyond, that has really clear measures when it comes to tender and procurement criteria beyond price, which are really fostering resilience. But we need more. We need also to look into how can we stimulate investments in R&D and manufacturing in Europe, which is absolutely essential. So I really look forward to engage with the Commission, but also with the Parliament and Member States to have this conversation and discussion and to look how we can become even more resilient and I would say more competitive when it comes to manufacturing in Europe.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Kate, for stepping in for me. I sort of got thrown out by the poltergeist in my computer, so I'm back in now. We have a question that's come in for you, Rebecca, from Mensur Hamzic, and he asks, do you think API manufacturing will return to Europe after this experience? And if so, to what extent? And do you think it's going to diversify to more non-EU countries?
Well, we still have a lot of API. First of all, I think people sometimes don't see really how much we still have in Europe. So there is a good proportion of API production in Europe. And I think we also need to really make sure that this is seen and heard. I personally believe I would really focus, as I just said, on the API production and making sure we have a very resilient supply chain in Europe when it comes to these very critical life-saving products like the antibiotics and ICU. And there I strongly believe it will also depend on what I just said on the measurements, right? If we have a competitive European landscape, why not bringing API even more back? Because we can be competitive in Europe. It's not impossible, but there are certain measures which need to come in place. Will we bring back all APIs? I don't think it's the solution. As I said, we need to reduce dependency, and it's more to have maybe dual sourcing and to have two APIs from different regions So you have more autonomy and you have more flexibility when it comes to a shortage.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And we're now going to move to our final speaker, which is Adrian van der Hoeven, who is the Director General of Medicines for Europe. Adrian, having listened to all of this, what are your thoughts on what this all means for pharma policy going forward?
Oh, hi, Laura. Thanks for the question. Well, I think one of the critical points that was learned is how important a resilient and strong public health system is for Europe. I mean, we vaunt the merits of our public health systems, and I think in this particular circumstance, they were put under a lot of stress and faced a lot of challenges. Luckily, I believe we pulled through. One aspect of the public health system that maybe doesn't get a lot of the limelight is the importance of essential critical medicines. As was mentioned already, these are largely generic or off-patent medicines, lower cost, older medicines, and for once, they were considered very, very critical in terms of policymaking going forward. And I think that needs to be recognized in a future EU pharmaceutical policy. I think how that was recognized maybe was a bit of a challenge, because I think we faced in Europe two problems linked to each other. First of all, governments in the European countries went into a crazy panic mode in late February, early March, as they were confronted with a pandemic that they knew very little about. And we saw this as a huge struggle for the different countries of Europe to organize themselves. James and others have cited some of the problems. Christoph, the borders closed, governments didn't know how much medicine they needed, they didn't know how much medicine was in hospitals, all kinds of challenges. And when we face a challenge like that, panic and knee-jerk reactions don't help. They make the situation a lot worse. Also, this led to a kind of breakdown of the European Union on a very, like a short timeout from the European Union as borders closed and governments took national actions that did not help at all. They harmed access to medicines. And I think on the contrary, when we started to get organized, we organized ourselves as an industry together with our colleagues from the other side, with EFPIA, and we worked together with the European Commission. We were able to roll back some of those more extreme panic measures and to bring some European solidarity into play. And we had a very clear understanding and definition of what that solidarity meant. It meant that no matter what European country you were located in, we were going to do everything possible to get you medicine if you were sick and you needed it due to COVID or even for chronic diseases, for example. And I think the industry really delivered there. And to be honest, with the Commission as well, the Commission played a very big role there. I think looking forward as well, we learned that some aspects of the European regulatory system for pharmaceuticals, it's a very good system. It has very high scientific standards, but it's a very complex system when you need to make rapid changes, as you need to do in a pandemic. And a couple of things we learned there is that we need to have a certain amount of flexibility to make changes. For example, if one supplier has a problem, you need to switch to another. If you're supplying one market that has an oversupply, you have a market next door that has an undersupply, you need to move that product very quickly. It sounds very straightforward, but in practice, it is not. Just one example for the active pharmaceutical ingredients industry that you mentioned, it was really a struggle for them to make rapid changes in the system. We could introduce basically digital regulatory measures that would make this effort much, much quicker. Another aspect I think we learned is how to manage a shortage. So basically, in this crisis, what we had was a massive, massive increase in demand, especially for ICU medicines, but also for a lot of other medicines because of panic buying. And what you need to do in those cases is assess the situation, scale up output, and that's what we did together with our colleagues across the whole industry. Was we took everything we could do legally and we scaled up that supply by a massive amount. And that's what really made the difference to ensure that patients got their medicines. A final point, and Rebecca touched on it, I think there is a huge value to manufacturing of pharmaceuticals that is now more recognized. It's talked about by prime ministers of countries, and that's great. And this is an opportunity to build that more resilient manufacturing in Europe, but also for resilience, as was also pointed out by the colleagues. One thing we would encourage here is a bit more data and thorough analysis, our existing manufacturing footprint, our existing resilience, so that we build on that, we take steps to move forward. I think there's a lot of pie in the sky thinking out there right now, not based on data, not based on analysis. So let's bring everybody together, and we can definitely take steps forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. How do you see the industry's role in all of this, and also particularly in terms of avoiding country-first approaches to things like stockpiling and demand in future? How do you see the industry's role?
Well, I really want to commend the companies that we worked with. And my colleagues from the other side of the industry, FPA, we worked together, and we had a common ethical agreement at the beginning that we were going to make sure that European solidarity would apply, and that we would make sure the medicines would move to where the sick people are and not be hoarded by different actors, whether it's governments, whether it was hospitals, again, driven by a lot of panic. And this really happened not in all European countries, but in a few, and it had a big impact. So we had to really come together and fight against that. And most of the time we were able to do that with the help of the European Commission, I must concede. So where problems arose, we went to the Commission immediately. We asked for help. The Commission, with the limited power and authority that it has, it did take action. And so we were able, I think, jointly, industry and the Commission, to really take some measures. There are certain examples of some things where we failed, where we did not succeed, and it was a complete disaster. I'll give you an example. As I stated, the industry supplied all the markets, but in proportion to the patient need. So we calculated, as James pointed out, how many patients there were. So we had a pretty clear idea who needed how much. And we negotiated or discussed with the governments on this basis. Some governments didn't like that. They wanted a bigger share of the pie for themselves. So when the industry, entered into that kind of tough discussion based on patient need, governments tried to go around us so that they could hoard more for themselves. And what they did was they bought the active ingredients themselves. And then obviously governments can't manufacture, so then they had to find someone who could compound this, which is a kind of way of manufacturing sort of outside of the rules. And this can be done sometimes in hospitals or by other manufacturers. The problem with this is that when you manufacture this, the product has a very, very low shelf life, because you cannot prove the longer shelf life that a normal manufacturer can have. So a lot of this API then was manufactured. It has an extremely short shelf life, which means that this compounded product will not serve any purpose because it's now stockpiled, but it has a very short shelf life. So we're basically going to have to throw it in the garbage or incinerate it. This is material that normal manufacturers could have used to manufacture extra stockpiles or extra reserves, if you wish, for the whole of the European Union. Instead, we're literally going to throw it in the garbage. And this is the kind of hoarding tactics and hoarding maneuvers we cannot accept, and we need to fight even more strongly against in the future.
Thank you very much, Adrian. We have a question that's come in for you from the audience, actually, from a journalist, which you've partially answered, but I'll put it to you anyway. It's David Wallace from Generics Bulletin, and he asks, it seems that much of the key action to address COVID-19 has been industry-driven, and particularly Medicines for Europe-driven, modelling, coordination, green lanes, etc. In future, does more need to come from the Commission centrally in terms of a proactive response, rather than relying on industry to drive efforts on these activities?
Well, we did play a big role, and we were very much on the front lines. I think this is because we realized earlier on, and maybe we were more affected because of the volume of medicines we supply than others, that we were hit by the crisis much earlier. And this is what pushed us into action mode, I would say, very early. Already in February, we were warning about problems on the horizon. So I think sort of necessity drove the action and drove our industry into a lot of action. We worked an insane amount. We had executive and board calls at 11 p.m. on Saturdays to decide on what to do. I think, I think it would be unfair to say that the European Commission, with the limited resources and limited understanding they have of the markets, should somehow take the lead and drive everything. I think the reality is the industry has much more intelligence, much more information. So it's more of a partnership and a cooperation between institutions and the industry that can make things happen. This was demonstrated very clearly with the European Commission. Obviously we made a lot of requests, and the Commission, once it verified that was correct, took action. It was also the case with the European Medicines Agency and the network of national medicines agency. We warned we really needed some flexibility to scale up the production or the output to make sure we'd have enough of supply, and we were able to relatively quickly, compared to normal circumstances, agree to that and move it forward. So it's a partnership, it's a joint effort that can succeed.
Thank you very much, Adrian. And I'm now going to open the floor more generally to questions from the audience to all the panelists now. We've got about 10 minutes left for that. And we actually do have one for you, Nicola. So this is a question from Elke Gruten at Novartis. And she says that during COVID, Sandoz, so obviously this is what Rebecca was talking about before, and the broader Novartis group concentrated on bringing solutions to patients, not just through the supply network, as Rebecca's talked about, but also by providing digital solutions to patient groups and medical societies to support challenges around diagnosis, health literacy, and providing treatment. And her question is, what more can we as companies do to help during a pandemic, and where should healthcare systems be adapted to make sure care for all patients remains ensured? So that's for you, Nicola.
Thank you. Thank you, Elke. I think that a lot can be done, and what EPF finds valuable is the ongoing dialogue with industry in all of this. And I think we have a long tradition of working with Medicines for Europe and other trade associations with regular exchanges between industry leaders and indeed the patient community. So that's my first point. I think if we look back at the EPF Congress back in November last year, one of the issues that we were looking at was essentially meaningful patient involvement in health systems design, health systems strengthening. So I think what is really, really key is having an opportunity for patients themselves to actually engage at different levels of the health system and the ecosystem more generally, to really understand their experiences, to understand the outcomes that really matter to patients at the end of the day, because that's going to drive a much more efficient, effective, outcome-based approach overall. When it comes to digitalization and health data, obviously there's been a massive acceleration over the last few months, and what EPF would like to do together with industry and other partners is actually step back and think about the lessons learned, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and what we need to kind of continue to accelerate and actually mainstream. But actually, some of the things that happened during COVID-19, also in the digital space, that was perhaps a knee-jerk reaction and compromises a little bit patient safety or quality of care. We need to look at all of that very, very carefully and look at it from the lens, through the lens of the patient experience. So I think there's a lot that we can do together moving forward in order to extrapolate really very concrete positive lessons from COVID-19. But I think also, we need to look at, as a European society, at issues like resilience, we've talked about that, but also solidarity, the genuine role of civil society as, if you like, a watchdog, the opportunities now of the European health data space, etc. There's a huge amount that can be achieved, and I think we articulated that quite clearly in our open memo to industry right in the middle of the crisis, and we got very, very interesting and important responses from all of the health industry actors.
Thank you very much. Question for Adrian. Do you think that the European Commission and the European Parliament are now taking the right steps to prepare Europe for the future? And this question comes in from Victor Mendonça.
Thanks. Well, I think we're at the early stages of the lessons learned, and the Commission has just opened the debate on reviewing or updating the pharmaceutical legislation. So we're just at the early stages. I think most of the key issues are on the table about manufacturing resilience, security of supply, addressing and avoiding shortages would probably be even better. I do think that there's a dearth or a lack of sound analysis in a lot of the ideas. That's the concern that I have. There is a lot of data available that we can study and learn from to improve the system. And we're not really doing that. There are a lot of, let's say, narratives and stories out there that are just factually and data-wise incorrect to justify some of these ideas. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to develop policy making along those lines. So I think we can do a better job of analyzing our facts and our data and having good evidence-based policy changes. One example of that is around shortages. Obviously, everybody wants to work to avoid and prevent shortages. This is something we really need to work on. And the industry is really committed and engaged around this. But we don't see a lot of real understanding. We don't look at the root causes, economic root causes of consolidation or lack of incentives for resilience measures. These things are being totally ignored. Often what we will see is if something is slightly complicated, it's avoided. Even though most of the things that we need to do are relatively straightforward and are part of the EU policy framework, meaning these are measures that can be taken at EU level. So I think we just need to accept that we're going to have to rock the boat a little bit if we want to make sure we have good policy making.
Thank you very much. We just got time for a few more questions. So a question that's coming for Christoph. Christoph, as we enter an upcoming economic recession, what do you think needs to be done to rebuild health systems and support the industry?
Thank you, Laura. Well, that's a challenging question. Maybe just one short word to add to Adrian. I think also what we see now from the German presidency is that they are really working and they're really willing to implement the lessons learned. Now, what can we do now? Of course, we all know that from a health crisis, we are now in an economic crisis, and that means governments will have less budget available. And that means, in other words, we need to make sure that we spend the budgets very, very wisely. And again, I think, look, we stand for 70% of the medicines supplied in Europe. And we have heard from my colleagues earlier on that this race to the bottom would really, really endanger the strong resilience of supply and the security of supply that we currently have in Europe. And we need to make sure that we do not harm this any further. So in other words, what can we do in order to make sure that we still have or continue to have great healthcare systems in Europe is that we spend the money more wisely. And what do I mean by this? If you look at a WHO study, which is not very, very new, but a couple of years ago, I think 1-2 years ago, 20 to 40% of the spend in our healthcare system is still being wasted. We heard a very specific example from Adrian before. So I think we simply need to be smarter in how we spend the money so that in the interest of all of us going forward, we still continue to have these great healthcare systems.
Thank you very much. James, there's another question that's come in. Just it's talking about, do you think we're ready for some subsequent demand spikes later this year if there's a second wave? I know we're still in the first wave, some people would argue, and it's different regions of the world. How confident are you that your forecasting can help?
I'm of the opinion that the forecasting can definitely help. I guess my big concern right now is if you look at, say, Latin America and the massive spike that's going on out there, that's definitely putting pressure on the utilization of API supplies. So we're seeing key medicines, particularly in the neuromuscular category, blocker category, and the demand out of particularly Brazil is unprecedented. So I think it depends maybe when that spike hits and what other regions pandemic trajectory is looking like at the time. But there's right now a huge load around the world, and that will impact Europe's ability to actually obtain API and finished goods. I think it's worth reminding everyone, the actual daily incidence around the world keeps going up every day. We are not through this pandemic by a long chalk. And as much as it's abated to a degree in Europe, the pressure around the world continues to increase. So I'm definitely preaching not to be complacent. The modeling will help. It will help quantify the demand. But I am worried about the amount of availability, particularly of those key ICU medicine APIs.
Thank you very much, James. Rebecca, I'm going to bring you in at this point, if you could pick up on what James has said, but also there's a question that's come in for you, which is about your vision for robust supply chains, whether or not you see this as a short-term plan, or how long do you see it? Short, medium, longer term?
Well, I believe there are things we can do rather short term. So I think if you think about the stock and most probably inventory strategies, this is something I would see rather short term. But it took a long time. We have once been the pharmacy of the world in Europe, and it took 15 years roughly, where we saw the consolidation and the offshoring taking place. So I don't say it's going to take the same amount of time, but it is a mid to long term plan. And I think we need to have an ambitious goal, but also a realistic goal. So what does it exactly mean, right? Resilience. I think we need first to define what do we mean by resilience, and then have a roadmap. But it's not going to be a short-term, I would say, solution.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And on that note, we are at time, so we're just going to wrap up. And we're going to wrap up, rather than with me doing a conclusion, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to make one very concrete, practical recommendation about what needs to be done to bring all these learnings into the mix and to make sure that they feed into EU pharma policy. So I'm going to start with, in no particular order, Nicola. One final practical recommendation.
Thanks. I would say that in the context of the pharmaceutical strategy, we should have a permanent pharmaceutical forum that involves all of the stakeholders and industry to look at moving forward together.
Thank you, thank you, Nicola. Christoph.
Thank you, Laura. I think for me, the most important, the most crucial thing is that we continue to have this high-level dialogue with the key stakeholders, led by the European Commission, or its high-level pharmaceutical forums, action-oriented, and really looking forward to taking the right measures with all the key stakeholders around the table.
Thank you very much. James.
Hi, I guess my one is looking at how the market functions. It's very important we maintain pressure to get value-based procurement that reflects resilience. There's a tendency for governments to want to almost develop a command economy, a la Marx, and look at their own production. That doesn't work. Stimulate the market, much more like an Adam Smith approach, put recognition on the value, and that's how society gets what it needs.
Thank you very much. Rebecca.
Yeah, listen, I think we are all here, and this is the big opportunity to drive access to medicines for Europe. And I personally believe access has to do with affordability, but also with availability. No availability, no affordability, no access. So I think we need to find the right balance, and this is a unique chance to pause, take the learnings, and really rethink how do we find the equation between affordability and access to medicine.
Thank you very much. And Adrian.
Yeah, thanks. I think for me, the key lesson here is that with cooperation between governments and across the industry, we can solve almost any problem. Just as an example, we had certainty, full consensus across the industry, we would not be able to supply enough ICU medicines relative to the massive demand surge. We said we would do everything possible to minimize that. Not only did we minimize it, but we avoided shortages altogether. Why? Because we came together as one industry. We came together with the European Commission and the regulatory authorities, and we found the most creative ways to solve that, and we succeeded. And I think that shows that we can do almost anything through cooperation.
Thank you very much. And on that note, we're going to wrap up. I'd like to thank all the speakers for a really interesting discussion, and also to you, the audience, for all your questions. The session has been recorded, and you can find the link at YouTube and also at the Medicines for Europe website. So please do watch it again, send it round. We really appreciate your comments and your thoughts. And thank you all very much, and have a good day.
Thanks a lot.